animal-based products in places where crop production was impossible because of climate or soil. Also, they played a huge role in, for example, nutrient cycling. For example, in Europe, the cows would go out, they were free to roam and graze, and also they would go to forests. So when they came back to the villages, they would, through their manure, they would cycle the nutrients and make the soils near the villages more fertile for the crops to grow. Also, pigs played a huge role because they played a role in waste management in certain ways, and also could cycle the products, for example, acorns that were inedible to humans, and they would produce high value products in, well, in shape of meat in this case, but also in shape of manure. And also they played a huge role in pulling power. They would pull plows, for example, and it was really hard for the people themselves to work the soil, so they had this pulling power, right? And then this allowed humans to produce crops more efficiently because of the soil structure. But livestock had huge changes in the last century, especially after the Industrial Revolution. It's called, in terms of agriculture, it's called the Green Revolution, and we're going to discuss a bit in more detail how it has changed throughout the history. For example, the process that I've described, that, for example, cows would go out and pigs would go out, and then through manure they would make the soils more fertile. This changed and it got replaced by mineral fertilizers. So the byproduct that was beneficial for agriculture, for crop production, now became a nuisance that is currently really hard to manage. We have huge feedlots, they're producing a lot of manure, and instead of fertilizing the lands, in some cases, yes, they do manage it and they apply it to soils, mostly in developed countries and in very few cases. But the reality is that manure has been mostly replaced by chemical fertilizers. Also, about the pulling power, the bulls and the horses that were pulling the plows now got replaced by the tractors. So tractors are also playing a huge role, just as in any other transportation mode, in affecting the climate change and greenhouse gases, because they consume diesel, and through diesel the CO2 is being emitted. So, and the most important thing was that the animal welfare has changed. If cows and chicken and pigs, all these domesticated animals, were free to roam and had, so to say, better conditions to live in until they got slaughtered, now they have been moved into these feedlots and factory-like environments where animal welfare is a huge concern for most of the people. But we have to also mention that livestock production is still a very integral and important part of many societies, especially in developing countries. In Africa, for example, there are societies that have not shifted their productions to industrial ones, so their livelihoods mostly depend on it, and we have to take that into consideration as well when we're talking about the protein transition. And also, in some cases, for example, in Europe, there are many ecosystems that hugely depend on the cows grazing there, because if they do not graze these meadows and grasslands, the biodiversity there might get reduced and might get changed. So, when we're talking about the protein transition, we really have to take into consideration the changes and the context of how these animal production systems are already located in certain geographical areas. If we want to have a dialogue that makes sense and we somehow reach a better outcome for all kinds of ideologies. To explain very simply industrial process of the agriculture, the industrialization of agriculture is called green revolution. And through green revolution, the productivity of both animal and crop production has risen drastically. This was influenced first of all by invention of fertilizers and pesticides and huge adoption of it. Also the irrigation and agronomic methods were developed, and so this caused a huge surge in the productivity of agricultural products and productions. But there is a huge criticism of this process. Even though the productivity has risen drastically, there are many challenges associated with this industrialization. First of all, it's not sustainable, because if we continue producing like this, we're gonna deplete the natural resources, soil, first of all, water resources, and biodiversity. So the productions that were very productive in the beginning of 60s and 70s of the last century, the fertility is declining, so the productivity is declining. So we have to find a sustainable ways to produce our food. That's the first thing, that it's not sustainable. It has affected the environment in a very bad way, because it has critically decreased the biodiversity of natural ecosystems. For example, if we're producing crops on huge areas, right? We need to apply a lot of fertilizers and a lot of pesticides, and these pesticides, instead of killing only the pests that would negatively affect our crops, it also affects the beneficial organisms, right? We have heard about bees and that their populations are declining. So that's also a very big problem we need to fix. And in reality, even though there was more food available for people, and this has caused drastic rise in population numbers, still it didn't fix the food problem. We might have access to cheap calories, but this doesn't really mean that we're getting good food. We're not getting enough micronutrients, vitamins, and that's why in most of the countries, both in underdeveloped and developed countries, malnutrition is a huge problem. For example, in developed countries, obesity is a huge problem that is linked to heart disease and diabetes and etc. So we still need to figure out how to produce food that is both good for people and good for the environment. And this is a graph of population growth since the 60s of the last century. This was caused because there was, well, first of all, industrialization and also more food available. Since the last century, every year there are more 80 million people more on Earth. Today we have already reached 8 billion, and in the last century, in 60s, it was just 3 billion. So it's gonna still rise until, as you can see, the most probable scenario is the middle one, the blue one. So we need to fix food production, and we need to provide this many people with enough food. And at the same time, there is this trend that people are moving into the cities. So this is an important process, because as people move into the cities, their income is rising, and so is their, how do you say that? So they want to consume high value with high nutritional foods such as meats and dairy, and it is putting a lot of pressure on the natural environments additionally. So if we take a look at for example, the protein intake per capita in developed countries, you can see the uppermost, you can see the mouse, just a second. So yeah, here. So we see the North Americans, right? They consume around 60 grams per capita per day, and it is almost 6 times more than in Africa. If we expect that the whole world consumes meat just as Western world does, there's just not enough resources to do this. There is not enough land. So this emphasizes the fact that we have to really think about how to change the food systems. And if we take a look at how agricultural land is managed and what it is used for, the 40% of the agricultural land, well, half of the agricultural land is used for livestock production, but there are grasslands included. But there is also arable land, which is land that can be used either for feed production or crop production, right? So 40% of arable land is used again for feed production. So this is a huge area, and we'll discuss this in a bit more in detail, how this land can be used to produce food, not for animal sector but for people as well. And as you can see on this photo right here, this is a very common image that you can see in developed countries. Huge areas that was before meadows with high biodiversity now are being transformed into ecosystems that where there are like there is one crop and very low biodiversity due to so many pesticides and fertilizers being used. And also feed production that is being used in animal agriculture is associated with deforestation. I don't know if you can see the left photo, but it's taken in Southern America. We have all heard about the processes, right? They cut down the trees, they use timber, and then they convert these forest areas into arable lands that is being used for soy production. And this soy is being then shipped to Holland or European countries to be fed to livestock. Obviously, we need to stop cutting down the trees, especially if we're dealing with climate change. And we need to find just better ways to feed this sector. And this is one of the most horrific facts actually that is happening when you're producing at such a large scale. It's called eutrophication, which means when you apply too many fertilizers, for example nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizers, not all of it is being absorbed by the plants. And these fertilizer residues end up in water, in rivers, and then in the bottom picture you see the Gulf of Mexico. And when you take a look at the Northern America, we have all heard of Mississippi River, right? And there on the both sides there are the states which are agricultural states. They apply a lot of fertilizers, and all these residues end up in Gulf of Mexico. So what this causes, these fertilizers allow the algae blooms, and they deplete all the oxygen in water, which is causing dead zones, meaning there is not enough oxygen for fish and other living organisms to live. So this area, I don't know if you can see it, but all this green area is a dead zone. Everything inside has pretty much gotten depleted of oxygen. And this happens every spring, because spring is when the agricultural season is starting, and that's when the fertilizers are being applied to. So this was very brief introduction of the environmental impacts livestock feed production can have, but how livestock affects the environment. One of the biggest concerns is climate change, and I want to talk about the climate and climate change in very briefly, in very simple terms, just to explain what's the difference between weather, climate, and climate change, and climate variability, because they're always being, if someone is not in this field, they're mostly being confused, right? So weather, it's always dynamic, it's always changing. We had rain, now it's cloudy, so it's in a short observation of time, right? But climate is mainly long-term observations of these weather variables, and mostly it's being measured in like 10-year time frames, and it looks at the precipitation, the water and rainfall, and temperature averages, right? So when we talk about climate variability, we can often hear that there are people saying that it has always been so cold in winter and so hot in summer, and they're talking about variability. So the trend is pretty much unchanged when we're talking about variability. But if we're talking about climate change, the trend is growing. It's being tilted, and we have each, I don't know, maybe not every year, but every 5 or 10 years, we can observe the long-term averages and see that we might have record maximum temperatures or record rainfalls. So, and that's a fact. There are many research papers, and there is a consensus where there was this meta-analysis, which means these are desk research type of analysis, where they take a bunch of scientific papers, several hundreds, and they assess whether these climate experts agree on this. And there are many. I think I have the references in the end about this consensus that climate change is indeed happening. So what causes climate change? In very simple terms, it's being caused by greenhouse effect, and greenhouse effect has always existed. Without it, the Earth would be too cold for living organisms to live, right? So the energy comes from the sun, and it's being reflected. Some part of it, the energy is being reflected from Earth, and some part is being absorbed by the molecules in the atmosphere. So these molecules, which are important in our case, which are tied to anthropogenic, so human activity, are in this presentation we're just gonna need methane, nitrogen oxide, and CO2. So these are the three main greenhouse gases that we're talking about when we're talking about the impacts of humans on the atmosphere. As soon our activities produce all these gases, and it's being released from various sectors. For example, the leading one is energy production. We burn coal to produce electricity, we burn fossil fuels to drive our cars and fly our planes, but also it's being released when we're heating up the buildings, for example, because we're using, in most cases, gas, right? And every burning process has a byproduct of CO2. And also, if we take a look at this orange graph, this is everything related to agriculture and other type of land use. It's 24%. But here is also forestry and forest management. If we just focus on emissions from livestock production and animal production, 15% of all greenhouse gases is associated with this sector. And especially methane is very important one, and methane is in direct correlation with livestock production, especially when we're talking about cows, when we're talking about sheep and goats, because they have this special, how to say, digestion. Yes, thank you. They have this digestive system, and they're called ruminants, and the process that is going on in their stomachs is called enteric fermentation. So through enteric fermentation, the gases that cows and sheep and goats are releasing is methane, and methane has this so-called warming potential that is much higher than CO2. And so when we're talking about greenhouse gas emissions in animal sector, we're talking about methane through enteric fermentation, but also any type of gases that are being released during the production of food, for example, that is being used, feed, for example, that is being used in animal sector. So obviously there are huge environmental impacts that this sector has, and one of the ways to fix this problem is well, obviously we have to take a holistic approach and discuss every possibility how to tackle different problems. For example, if we're talking about feed production, this is a topic of agriculture and not livestock production, right? If we're using too many fertilizers and we're affecting the environment, we need to fix our crop production. But if we're talking about the release of methane, for example, there are some experts talking that we need to intensify the production more, so there is more meat per greenhouse gases being emitted, or there are talks about food additives that can release, that can reduce the methane production during the enteric fermentation. But of course, when we're talking about this type of changes, we're not taking into consideration that animal welfare is being worsened in this scenario, right? So we definitely need to find ways how to, well, first of all, transform livestock production so that animal welfare is increased, so that animals have better lives, and in good cases we don't slaughter them at all. But we also need to acknowledge that it's not going to happen in a day, right? There are developing countries that need all these transitions, that you cannot just distribute, for example, meat alternatives in places where in Africa, for example, the whole livelihoods depend on the livestock production. So this will have to happen at the same time. For example, we're still gonna have intensive food production for a foreseeable future. But to tackle climate change, maybe until we fix the other problems, maybe we use these food additives. And there is this thing called meat paradox. There are a lot of people, including me, I have to admit, that still consume meat, but they're trying to reduce their intake. They're trying to be more aware of where meat comes from and whether the animals that were being slaughtered were grass-fed or were locked out in feedlots, or this term is coined meat paradox. There are people who have realized how bad the animal sector can treat the animals, but they're still sometimes consuming meat. So why I'm talking about this is that if there was good options for them to choose, if there was a burger that tastes good and they can just easily consume it instead of beef burger, in this case they would do it. So what we're going to discuss now is the so-called protein transition, how this process is going to happen, so that the people who are still meat eaters, we have to offer them something in alternative, right? And just beans and lentils in most cases just are not that effective, because most of the people are still tied to their sensory sensory feelings. I can't find the right word, sorry. So just the statistics, how much protein we're producing. So each year there is 600 million tons of protein being produced. This is animal protein plus plant protein. And out of this 630 million, 490 million is plant protein. So if we hear that if we somehow replace the animal protein with plant protein, we have to produce more plants, it's a wrong assumption. And to feed 9 billion people, we need around 220 million tons. So that's we are producing more than enough, almost twice as enough plant protein. But currently, 40% of all this protein that we're producing right now, this 600 million, 40% goes to the animal sector. So we can assume that all this protein that is going there, humans can consume it, right? And as a final part of my presentation, I want to talk about these plant-based foods and plant-based alternatives, which are products that contain no ingredients of animal origin, and they're designed specifically to mimic or replace conventional animal products. We're going to focus mostly on that. So, what are the main benefits if we switch to plant-based diets? And also I want to emphasize that when we're talking about switching to plant-based diets, we're talking about Western developed world, because right now we are the only ones who can afford this in most cases. And we have to also somehow create the systems that the developing countries developing countries can skip. So the main benefits are animal welfare is being increased, right? We have more sustainable productions because the effect on the environment, the influence on the environment is being reduced, and food security is being increased because if we'll use our lands to produce crops, there will be enough food to feed even the undernourished people around the world. And in the end, there are many health benefits to consuming plant-based diets. So what do they use mostly when they create these plant-based alternatives, right? Mostly it's the plants that have high protein contents, like lentils, beans, soy, and etc. And the good thing about this type of plants, the lentils, is that they're also very good for the environment because they're producing nitrogen in the soil. And we don't need to use that many mineral fertilizers anymore. For example, in crop rotations, when you're not producing when you don't have the monocrop productions, there is one of the crops always lentils, because you don't need to use that many fertilizers anymore. The rest of the ingredients that you can find in meat alternatives are grains, nuts, plant-based oils, and also many herbs and spices. And if we take a look at the industry itself, there is a huge interest, a growing interest in investors. This is from Bloomberg, I think, and as you can see, it is expected to grow rapidly because in Western societies it is well acknowledged that plant-based products are just going to become more popular. And this is a very brief discussion on what the main challenges are. And first of all, obviously, it's the societal norms and how people behave around food, right? For example, in Georgia, if you become a vegetarian or vegan, and also in other places, if the culture is meat consuming, you have this societal pressure that you have to eat chingali or ntzwati, or like, I don't know, you're less of a man if you don't eat meat or something like that. And also the ideology has to change, and it has to be obviously in alignment with the society that you're in. And one of the biggest challenges, again, is this holistic approach. The biggest problem that I see when we're talking about protein transition and sustainability is that these different actors, including vegans, including meat eaters and farmers and producers, they don't really have this dialogue that has many arguments, that is trying to fix these global problems, right? So we need holistic approach, and it has to be also fair to consumers. It has to be fair to farmers. For example, there's this one example where in Netherlands they stopped importing soy from Southern America, and it does affect the farmers there. So this transition has to be gradual so that no society or stakeholder suffers from it. And also we have to diversify these transitions, and yeah, this is pretty much what I've talked about right now. So how do we make the plant transition more and plant-based alternatives more likable, so to say? There are many concerns. In most cases, the foods that are tasty and are also vegan, unfortunately, they are, I'm talking about plant-based alternatives. For example, this plant-based meats are in most cases not as affordable as in some cases animal products. So the cost of these plant-based alternatives need to get reduced. Also, taste plays a huge role. They need to taste as good as meat, and it has to be comfortable. It has to be easy to cook. It has to be easy to distribute, and it has to fit in our daily lives easier. And as the last slide, just the idea of how the transition has to happen is that, first of all, we need to raise awareness about the environmental impacts, about the welfare of the animals, because I don't know who said it, but if the feedlots had glass doors or something, everyone would be vegetarians, right? Because we are turning a blind eye in most cases how cruel animal and livestock productions can be. And I'm not talking about all types of productions. There are much friendlier ways to produce animal products as well. So awareness raising. Also, we have to assist the policies so that the farmers who are producing, for example, protein crops are being, for example, subsidized, because the cost of those products is very low. So the interest in producing this type of crops is very low. And also there is a lack of social research, and this plays a huge role in developing the new technologies and new plant-based products. There are many startups that are failing too fast, so we really need to learn what the consumers really want to somehow use this social research to design the products that they want to consume. And in some cases, because there is such a high diversity of the plant-based alternatives, they're not always very healthy. Sometimes they have a lot of salt and a lot of like additives that might be not as healthy as the other alternatives. And also we have to assist the farmers in this transition. So yeah, sorry, I had my speech prepared in English, so a lot of the stuff was lost in the presentation, but if there are questions, I would gladly answer them. Yes?
Yes, there's different kind of data, more or less substantial from different kind of scientists, different forecasts about what's going to happen if we continue with these trends, like consuming animal products, and with these demographical trends, and with these trends of consumption. How do you think, in your opinion, according to your data, what are the forecasts if the humanity will go in terms of future to the plant-based diet, or what will happen and in which time perspective if humankind won't?
The transition is going to happen inevitably, because our food production systems right now are so unsustainable that if we don't act right now, first of all, climate change is going to get worse, and just land management in general is going to decline. So it's going to cause, if we continue business as usual, as they have coined this term, we might have very bad outcomes. The plant-based alternatives and plant-based diets are very promising, especially if Eastern societies and underdeveloped societies follow the Western societies as well. And also, due to a lot of research and due to a lot of funding, we're gonna have very good plant-based alternatives. And as I said, if people have a choice between products that in most cases taste same and have same nutritional value, it is expected that most people will still incorporate more plants into their diets. But it's going to be a long process, and we also have to take into consideration again context, and we really have to find solutions for very specific scenarios, right? Because there are societies living in mountains and their whole livelihoods depend on it. So again, yeah, it's gonna need to be like very context specific. Yes.
The Georgia scenario, so the animal agriculture seems to be growing here in Kashmir, even down to snakes.
Yes.
Where do you see Georgia in its future prospect?
Well,
Is it following the West in terms of developing animal agriculture, and then it will suddenly realise that it can go another way? Or will it be too late by then?
this is my personal opinion, not based on any type of research, but just like my own experience, that we're very slow in adopting technologies in general, especially in agriculture, because there's a lack of professionals in this. I mean, both in veterinary and both in crop production. So even though there are huge farms being opened, still the number is very low, and I've heard about the investments they put tons of like millions into the factories, but still they don't get the good results. Yes, we are trying to intensify our productions, both plant and livestock, but I think by the time that we somehow reach a scale that really matters, the technology in the world is going to be much more advanced, and yeah.
It would be nice if the realisation could be there.
Yes.
Plant-based diet and
Yes.
Georgia, organic, all of this before they got to the stage where
Yeah, there is one NGO that is working like specifically on organic production and then animal welfare. And I mean, if you take a look at the livestock production in Georgia, the cows here are mostly happy because they roam around, and like the intensive agricultural farms, the number is very low in Georgia. So, yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.